some of the technical demands, if you like, on the House at this point. I think that Labour's Jeremy Corbyn will be on his feet within a few seconds. Maybe time to squeeze in a quick comment from Laura here.
I think interesting to see Philip Hammond, who is normally a very deadpan politician, feeling relaxed and confident enough to be frequently cracking jokes throughout that budget. Very interesting indeed. Of course, the big challenge is whether the rhetoric, we heard lots of use of the word fairness, matches the reality.
This was a budget of utter complacency about the state of our economy. Utter complacency about the crisis facing our public services, and complacent about the reality of daily life for millions of people in this country. Entirely out of touch with that reality of life for millions. This morning, over 1 million workers will have woken up not knowing whether they work today, tomorrow or next week. Millions more workers know their next pay packet will not be enough to make ends meet. Millions struggling to pay rent or mortgage, with private renters on average pay nearly half their income in rent. Yesterday, Mr. Deputy Speaker, over 3,000 people in this country will have queued up at food banks to feed themselves and their families. Last night, Mr. Deputy Speaker, over 4,000 people will have slept rough on the streets of this country. And the Chancellor made his boast about a strong economy. But who is reaping the rewards of this economy? For millions, it is simply not working. Not working for the NHS in its worst crisis ever, with funding being cut next year. Not working for our children's schools. Not working for our children's schools, where pupil funding continues to be cut. Not working for our neighbourhoods, which have lost 20,000 police officers, leaving the force in a perilous state in many parts of the country. And not working for our dedicated public services and the people who work in them. Nurses, firefighters, teachers, no pay rise for 7 years for them. And for people with disabilities, who are twice as likely to be living in poverty, and that this government is denying them the support that the courts say they need. 4 million children living in poverty, which will rise by another million in coming years. Not working for the thousands of young people who can't get anywhere to live, can't get on the housing ladder, and cannot, in many cases, leave the parental home. Parents of grown-up children who would expect to be debt-free by now, but having to bail out student debt or try and help with a deposit to get housing if they can manage it. And 1 million elderly people, and I'll come on to this again, denied the social care they need due to the 4.6 billion cuts made by his government with the support of the Lib Dems over the past 5 years. Not for pensioners, for whom the security of the triple lock remains in doubt. Mr. Deputy Speaker, that is the reality facing Britain today. A government cutting services and living standards of the many to fund and continue to fund the tax cuts of the few. There are some people, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who are doing very well under the Conservative government. The chief executives of big companies, now paid 180 times more than the average worker and taxed less. Big corporations making higher profits and being taxed less. Speculators making more and being taxed less. And wealthiest families taxed less due to cuts in inheritance tax. All this adds up to 70 billion of tax giveaways over the next 5 years to those who need it the least. This government is a government with the wrong priorities. Let me give you 3 examples. The pain of losing a child is unimaginable for most of us. But for those who do, that pain is worsened by the stress of having to pay for their own child's funeral. I pay tribute to my friend, the member for Swansea East, for her campaign to establish a children's funeral fund. But far from establishing such a fund, costing just £10 million a year, the government is instead cutting support for bereaved families. 3 in 4 bereaved families will receive less. This is utterly heartless. Despite generous tax giveaways at the top end, there was no money either for the 160,000 people with disabilities that a court has ruled deserve a higher rate of personal independence payments. These are people with debilitating mental health conditions, dementia, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder. The Prime Minister came to office talking about fighting burning injustices. Less than 9 months later, she seems to have forgotten all about them, because none of them are being fought today. Low pay holds people back, and it's holding our country back. We're the only major developed country in which economic growth has returned, yet workers are worse off. Wages are still below the 2008 level. Inflation rising, an urgent need to address the pressure on people's incomes, massively rising personal debts, rising energy bills, and the cost of the weekly shop, transport costs and housing costs all rising. The Chancellor faced a series of tests as to whether he would stand on the same side of the people or not. He could have raised the minimum wage to the level of the living wage, the real living wage of £10 per hour, as we, the Labour Party, are pledged to do. It would pay for a pay rise for 6 million people in this country, 62% of whom are women. He failed to do that. Since 2010, millions of public sector workers have endured a pay freeze and then a pay cap. Dedicated public servants who keep our services going have lost over 9% of their real wages, or will have done by 2020. He could have ended the public sector pay cap, as we are pledged to do, and given a pay rise to 5 million dedicated public servants who we all rely on day in, day out in our hospitals, our health service in general, and our local government. He failed to do that. It's an insult to say they deserve falling living standards when we all know those in the public sector are working harder than ever, covering the jobs of those that have gone. There is a crisis too, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in job security. Millions of workers don't know whether or not they'll be working from day to day. Millions of workers who don't know how many hours they'll be working this week or next week. Just imagine what it's like to try and plan your life if you don't know what your income is going to be from one week to the other. Because, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that is the reality.
Can I just say to these benches, I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition. I don't want him shouted down, because you may not be interested, but our constituents out there want to hear what the alternative is. So please, if the whip wants to be funny, he can go and get a cup of tea now. OK, so let's just show the same respect that was given to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There is nothing funny about being one of 900,000 workers on 0 hours contracts, 55% of them women. He could have announced a ban on 0 hours contract, as we are pledged to do. Again, he failed. But 0 hours contracts, Mr. Deputy Speaker, are only the tip of an iceberg. 4.5 million workers in Britain in insecure work. 2.3 million working variable shift patterns, 1.1 million on temporary contracts. We have long argued for clampdown on bogus self-employment, but today the Chancellor seems to put the burden on self-employed workers instead. There has to be something for something deal, so I hope the Chancellor will bring forward extra social security in return. One policy that Labour backs is extending statutory maternity pay to self-employed women. which is likely to cost just £10 million per year. Low pay and insecure work have consequences for us all. Mr Deputy Speaker, in reality, we all pay for low pay. There are 1 million working households having to claim housing benefit. Just get that figure, 1 million working households claiming housing benefit because their wages aren't enough to pay the rent. And there are 3 million working families who simply rely on tax credits to make ends meet. This is modern Britain. The most effective way of boosting wages and increasing job security, as all studies show, is actually to improve collective bargaining through a trade union. Words that the Chancellor did not use in his speech. But instead of a Trade Union Act we have which will further shackle unions and perpetuate chronic low pay, which actually costs us all a lot of money through in-work benefits, we will promote collective bargaining and repeal the Trade Union Act. This is a Chancellor and a government not on the side of the workers, not on the side of the taxpayers who pick up the bill for low pay and insecure work. Mr Deputy Speaker, on International Women's Day, did the Chancellor deliver a budget that works for women? According to the House of Commons Library analysis, commissioned by my friend the member for Rotherham, who is doing a brilliant job speaking up for women from our front benches, 86% of the savings the Treasury has made from tax and benefits have fallen on women. Women's lives have been made more difficult through successive policies of this government. Women struggling with more caring responsibility due to the continuing state of emergency in social care. The waspy women born in the 1950s who, with little notice, having to face a crisis in retirement they could not possibly have predicted. 54,000 women a year are forced out of their jobs through maternity discrimination. They can't afford this government's extortionate fees to take their employer to a tribunal in search of justice. Women up and down the country who will have to wait another 60 years before the gender pay gap is closed. The hundreds of women being turned away from domestic violence shelters every year through lack of space or appropriate services, or because they've simply been closed. Mothers struggling put under more pressure through cuts to universal credit and tax credits. And if this wasn't bad enough, to cut benefits to children whose only crime is to be born third or fourth in a family. Most shamefully, Mr Deputy Speaker, as of next month, women will have to prove their third child is a product of rape if they wish to qualify for a child tax credit for that child. I pay tribute to my friend the member for Rotherham and the honourable member for Glasgow Central for their campaigning on this issue. I hope the Chancellor will reverse this cut. There is, Mr Deputy Speaker, a housing crisis, a crisis of supply and of affordability. Since 2010, house building has fallen to its lowest rate in peacetime since the 1920s. The building of social homes for rent is at its lowest level for a quarter of a century. Did he empower councils to tackle the housing crisis by allowing them to borrow to build council housing, as we are pledged to do? No. Have they replaced council houses sold under right to buy, as they promised? No. Just 1 in 6 have been replaced. And was there any commitment to return to the councils the £800 million right to buy proceeds the Treasury has taken back, which would build 12,000 homes? No. Did he scrap the unfair bedroom tax, as we are pledged to do? No. Did he reverse housing benefit cuts that would take support away from 10,000 young people, despite the opposition of Shelter, Crisis and Centrepoint, which even the honourable member for Southgate, Enfield Southgate, correctly described as catastrophic? Last week, the Institute for Government said there were clear warning signs of the damaging impact of government's cuts on schools, prisons, health and social care. This government has taken a sledgehammer to public services in recent years. The Chancellor now expects praise for patching up the small part of that damage. The budget didn't provide the funding necessary now for the crisis in our NHS, which the BMA reckons needs an extra £10 billion. It didn't provide the funding necessary to end the state of emergency in social care now, which needs £2 billion a year just to plug the gaps, according to the King's Fund. That is not met by £2 billion over 3 years. The money is needed now. More than 1 million people, mainly elderly people, desperate for social care, still can't get it. The money ought to be made available now, because this government ducks really tough choices, like asking corporations to pay a little bit more in tax. Not every local authority can just text Nick and get the deal they want. And other council services are suffering as well. Our communities are stronger when we have good libraries, and they are valuable, obviously, for children, but for the entire community. 67 closed last year because of local government underfunding. 700 Sure Start centres closed because of lack of funding for local authorities, denying the life chances that a Labour government delivered to them with the opening of Sure Start centres in the 90s. And 600 youth centres have closed as well. These painful decisions are being taken by councils not because they want to do it, but just because they don't have enough money even to keep essential services running because of the slashing of their budgets year on year. And it goes on. It affects our communities and our lives in so many ways. Last year, councils proposed a sell-off of school playing fields, the equivalent of 500 football pitches. 500 pitches not available for young people to indulge in sport. It's our duty as a community, surely, to ensure all our young people, wherever they live, have a decent chance to grow up with a library, with a playing field, with a Sure Start centre. It's not a lot to ask. The Chancellor boasts, Mr Deputy Speaker, of a strong economy, but abandoned the targets of the previous Chancellor, so let's give a more realistic context to today's figures. The deficit that was going to be eradicated in 2015, do you all remember the long-term economic plan? The debt was going to peak at 80% of GDP and then start falling. Our economy is not prepared for Brexit. We still have an economy suffering from underinvestment and an over-reliance on consumer spending and wholly unsustainable levels of personal and household debt. Investment must be evenly spread around our country. And despite the announcements today, London continues to receive 6 times as much investment as the North East. And so that is why Labour is backing a fair funding formula for investment so that every area gets its fair share of capital spending. What's been announced today doesn't achieve that. You can't build a northern powerhouse or a Midlands engine if the investment doesn't follow the soundbite. Our country currently spends 1.7% on research and development, which is well below the OECD average. The strongest economies spend over 3%. In the immediate term, and the Chancellor didn't have much to say about this, he must focus his attentions on the precarious future of skilled workers' jobs at Vauxhall in Ellesmere Port and Luton and Ford in Bridgend. It would give export businesses more confidence if the government clearly committed to negotiating for tariff and impediment-free access to the single market and dropped this reckless threat of turning Britain into a tax haven on the shores of Europe. One of the biggest challenges facing our country, Mr Deputy Speaker, is environmental. It's climate change. This government is failing to lead, failing to drive a mission-led industrial strategy as our own Business Select Committee has recommended. The Chancellor failed to make energy efficiency a national infrastructure priority, no commitment to establishing zero carbon standards on new building, and unclear about investments in public transport that will definitely reduce pollution. The poor air quality is appalling. It's killing thousands of people in this country. It's taking away the life chances of many children growing up alongside polluted roads. The good work being done by Labour's London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, the good work being done by the Welsh Labour government has rightly recognised this as an urgent public health crisis, particularly for children. We have to deal with this crisis and deal with it urgently. There cannot be, Mr Deputy Speaker, an industrial strategy or productivity gains unless there's serious investment in skills. Adult skills training cut by 54%, further education by 14%. The small amounts committed today are long overdue but woefully insufficient. Over the coming years, the school's budget is being cut by 8%. Does the Chancellor really want fewer teachers and teaching assistants, larger classes, shorter school days? Which is it? I agree with the Prime Minister that every child deserves a decent education. Every community deserves decent schools. You do it by working with those communities to provide those schools, not plonking into them selective schools which are not being demanded by those communities. The money announced by the Prime Minister yesterday for new grammar schools is frankly a vanity project. Cancel this gimmick. Reject selection and segregation, and why not honour their own 2015 manifesto pledge to protect per-pupil funding, which is clearly not happening. This is a budget that lacks ambition for this country and lacks fairness. It demonstrates again the appalling priorities of this government. Another year, tax breaks for the few, public service cuts for the many. When she took office, the Prime Minister said, if you're one of those families, if you're just managing, I want to address you directly. This budget does not address them. It failed them. This budget has done nothing to tackle low pay, nothing to solve the state of emergency that persists for so many people demanding and needing health and social care now, and nothing to make a fair economy that truly works for everyone. It's built on unfairness, and it's built on failure to tackle unfairness in our society.
Andrew Tyree.
Well, I don't think...
Jeremy Corbyn, the Leader of the Opposition there.